All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Dru Johnson. Dr. Johnson is Templeton Senior Research Fellow and Director of the Abrahamic Theistic Origins Project at Wycliffe Hall, Visiting Professor at Hope College, Director of the Center for Hebraic Thought, and co-host of the OnScript podcast. He is also the author of the brand new book, Understanding Biblical Law, Skills for Thinking with and Through Torah, out now on Baker, where he equips readers of the Bible to better understand the law, how it functioned in antiquity, and what it means for us today. We'll be discussing this book on the show today. Dr. Johnson, welcome back to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Pleasure to be here, Alex. Thanks for having me on again after I tanked it last time, I think.
Oh, you crushed it last time. And I have some science nerd friends that really loved your last book a lot and really appreciated what you did.
Oh, good.
But it's funny because I was thinking about it. It didn't seem like it was that long ago that we talked, but I guess it's been like a year and a half now. So for my new listeners, go ahead and tell us about yourself, your background, and your work.
So academics is in some ways, or I should say higher education is a third career for me. So I came in after 7 years in the military, 6 years in IT, 8 years as a pastor, and then went and did a PhD. So that to say, I always feel like I'm very different than my colleagues, not all of them, but a lot of them that just kind of went straight through school. And I was very interested when I started studying scripture more closely in the original languages. I became instantly fascinated with this issue of how do we know things? How do they think we know things? How do they understand the world? Wow, they seem to have really sophisticated thoughts. It's one of the privileges of having a really good Hebrew and Greek education in a seminary or various places you can get them is you just begin seeing like, oh, everything is way more complicated than I thought it was. And I don't mean in a bad way. I mean, it's more sophisticated. It's more nuanced. It's like, oh, wow, this is not just religious revelation, spiritual speak. It's actually like cutthroat arguing with the reader and the people of God. So I think I started my career in academics has been paying attention to the sophistication of their thought and how they lay out arguments and how they reason with both the people of God and kind of the people outside of the people of God. Like, how do they think the world is? What do they think our reason for being here is? And then how do things work? So I call that kind of the biblical philosophical style. I'm interested in how they think about the world. And I think the last time I was on here, I was talking about my Darwin book, where I just said, hey, they have some sophisticated thoughts on natural selection too. So let's like put them in conversation. So that's kind of what I'm most interested in. Which makes this book a little bit outside of the norm for me.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you what motivated you to write this book, because it is very timely, and the issue of the law, I think, is in some quarters of Christianity extremely complicated, and in other quarters of Christianity just entirely misunderstood.
Right.
Actually, there's probably a lot of overlap between those two camps. But what motivated you to write a book on this particular subject?
I think it's one of those, teaching undergraduates, it's one of the issues that comes up again every semester, right? When you have to do a big spiel about like, look, we're going to work through some of the laws, or, hey, when Jesus talks about, he's talking about the law, but he's not talking about the way you think of law. And you have to do all this kind of tap dance. And you realize even when you're done doing all the tap dance and you try to show them that our views of the law that we drag to the scripture don't actually work. They don't help you at all understand anything that's going on in scripture. In fact, they may make your understanding worse.
Yeah.
And so just running it, and obviously when I preach or teach in a church, you see the same thing. And so I think it was a lot of frustration with the misunderstanding of the law, which is a good motivator. Is like, okay, people misunderstand it. Let's help them better understand it. And as I think I said in the introduction, we're not trying to get to the right view of the law. We're just trying to do better rather than worse.
Right.
Like that's the win, is just doing better, right? Or as my kids say to me all the time, do better, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, it does a really great job of addressing a lot of these questions, and I know that like from being in ministry, and then we're leading a small group right now. My wife and I are leading a small group at our church right now, and questions about the law come up all the time. And like I grew up in a Lutheran church where the answer was basically, well, the law is irrelevant because Jesus came, right? But it doesn't take much time in the New Testament to realize that that paradigm doesn't quite work.
Right.
And so I'm really looking forward to talking to you about like a lot of the particulars of your book. But before we even get to that, one of the really interesting things that you do in this book, which I don't think I've ever seen in any other work of biblical scholarship before, is you have a short story interwoven in the text that kind of takes a specific example of a law and shows how it would have worked in antiquity. So talk to us about the short story and what was your reason for wanting to include kind of like a fictional narrative in this work of biblical scholarship.
Yeah, and maybe not how it worked, but how it could have possibly worked. Because
Yeah.
I was very sensitive as I was writing that story. Every sentence, I was like, I don't know, would they do this? Would they say this? Is this how they would act? I think what I came to realize after a while of teaching about the law, and even as I was writing this book, it became a fresh issue for me, was the problem is often and this is true of a lot of things in understanding scripture, is a failure of imagination. We read these texts, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, or things that seem to indicate that a woman taken in war would have to marry, the man who took her captive. And we just have no imagination for any world in which that would be a justice keeping activity,
Right.
or that would be fair to the individuals involved. And partly that's due to lots of problems that we'll probably talk about here. But so I think I just said, okay, well, if the issue is a lack of imagination, we need to give some imagination. And the best way, and I don't mean imagination in like, just imagine, kind of like Barney, kind of like we're going to make believe something. But really, like when you look at any piece of data, when you drive, you're constantly filling in the holes of what you can't see with your imagination. So I mean imagination in a very intellectual sense.
Yeah.
And so when you run into these laws that don't make any sense or seem barbaric or overly harsh, it's usually because you don't have anything to fill in, like in a way, because you're reading about how God is loving and kind and he cares for his people. And then he's like, but I will kill all of you. We're just like, how does this work? So the story allowed me to flesh that out in a very careful way. And it's not a long story. It's only a couple, I don't know, maybe 5,000 words of the whole book is that story. And it's very on point. And the fiction editor wanted me to explode it and talk about everybody's feelings. And
No.
I was like, no. This story is meant to serve this one purpose. And just say, okay, there's this law that says if you don't build a protective roof on your roof or a protective wall on your roof so that people don't fall off, if somebody falls off, then you're liable to blood guilt, which means it's a capital crime. Like it's the same as murdering somebody, or it could be. And so I kind of play that out. I'm like, all right, let's make that the crime. So we just got a whodunit. We find a dead body in between two villages, which was another strategic pull on another set of laws that says, okay, what do you do when a crime happens, not in a village, but in between two villages?
Yeah.
So you get issues of jurisdiction and jurisprudence. And so I just played that out in the best way I could think. I had lots of people read that story and including archaeologists, to make sure I wasn't fudging anything. And they all said, yeah, okay, this seems like a perfectly reasonable way. And you're just watching a family and the elders of a village and the elders of two villages, and then they go appeal to the Levites later. You're just watching them wrestle through the facts on the ground, the law that they've heard read aloud, if that's what Israel was doing obediently. And then also all the stories that are embedded with the law, right? Okay, using those stories to kind of say, well, is this like when Joseph did that one thing? Or is this more like when Moses did that one thing, right? And trying to build the imagination for how the law seems to be constructed in such a way that it could be used in that way. It was tricky, and I felt very nervous every sentence I wrote. I felt very nervous about it. And also, like, I didn't want it to be a boring story. I wanted it to have some, I wanted to make you want to turn the page a little bit, maybe not as much as I can. So,
yeah, well, I think you pulled it off and it worked really well. And it does a great job of highlighting the themes that you discuss throughout the book. And really, like you said, the goal of this book and really the goal of my interview with you today is just to help the listeners and to help your readers read the law better, right? To have a
Right.
better way of thinking about it. And you already have talked about some of the failure, a lot of this comes down to our failure to imagine what that world is like. And right at the very outset of your book, you talk about kind of how like the number one factor that inhibits our imagination is our own kind of like presuppositional modern legal theories, right? Just like we have a certain way of thinking about law that's totally different than the way that they thought about it in antiquity. So talk to us about how our modern legal categories aren't really that helpful for interpreting the law.
And so maybe I could use imagination to discuss our market. So it really is our current legal imagination, which is very thick and robust, inhibits us from shifting over to this other imagination we need with ancient law. And so if you think about, we have a very cruel sense of law today in a couple of different ways. One, our law is almost not entirely, but almost entirely restrictive. So it's just looking at restricting activity. We're a liberal democracy. I don't need to tell anybody who probably listens to this podcast
Yeah.
that the idea is unless the law forbids you from doing it, then it's a free activity, right? Which generates, the silly questions people ask pastors and professors, where in the Bible does it say that I can't, smoke weed or have sex with my boyfriend or whatever? And then you have to look at them with that disappointed dad, face and go, well, that's not what's going on here.
Right.
And you see Jesus having this exact same encounters with some legal scholars of his day, and they're bringing that same kind of view that basically the law is a list of statutes that are legislated by an authoritative body that tell you what you can and mainly cannot do in American legal, right? So you cannot go above the speed limit. You cannot break and enter into somebody's house, right? You cannot fail to file your tax form. So that one is kind of a positive law where you have to file, but it's still punitively enforced, right? So you can't not do it.
Yeah.
And so if you take that view that basically that law is rules that you either break or keep these rules, and those are metaphors, breaking or keeping the law, right? You can't physically break a law. There's nothing there to break. It's an idea. And you take that back into anything before the Greco-Roman period, you're going to be at a loss to really figure out what they're doing. It's just not going to, that view breaks down very quickly. And notice that I just used break in two different metaphors there, right?
Yeah.
So that's important because the point that I make in the book is it does talk about keeping the law all the time in the Old Testament. You must keep these laws and statutes that I've set before you, right? But keep there is actually, it's a different metaphor than our break or keeping the law, where you either do it or you don't. You either speed or you don't, right? You either now there's lots of fuzzy areas in law,
right?
We typically think of law as you either have violated some aspect of the law or you have not. You're either safe or you're in some kind of punishable area. So they do use the metaphor to keep the law in the Old Testament quite often. But keep there is a metaphor for shepherding, tending, cultivating. So the man and the woman keep the garden in the Garden of Eden. So they cultivate, and you keep sheep, like as Cain famously says, "Am I a keeper of my brother?" Right. Yeah. So that it is using the metaphor of keeping, and it does have a metaphor for avar, which means something like going against, violating, going across. If the river's going this way, you're going against it in that way. It's kind of the metaphor there. But that even in that in itself lets you know that the primary metaphor for how the law works is it's a way. It's literally it's a derech in Hebrew. It's you're a walker who is going along the ways of the Lord. Turn back to the ways of the Lord. So it has all this formational, I'm trying to get you down this road. I'm trying to get you going in this direction. And even the term repent, there is no Hebrew word for repent. It's shuv, turn back to the ways of God, right? And so it's just a different metaphorical universe. There's a different concepts of what a law is and how it works. And it's, in some ways it feels very subtle. So you can read for quite a bit in the Hebrew law with your current legal imagination from like the United States or Britain or France. And you can get so far down the road, as it were, to mix all my metaphors. But after a while you realize like, wait, this doesn't work, or this seems like I'm getting contradictory information from this law than what I've heard elsewhere in these texts about God and what his plans are for people.
Yeah, and you also make the point too that the word Torah itself, which a
Yeah.
lot of English speakers such as myself have just always associated with law, and again, kind of like what you're saying, we think about laws and kind of the prescriptive, like you can't do that sense, right? But you argue in the book that the word Torah does not have any good modern English equivalent, right? That
Yeah.
word is a lot more dynamic than just simply the way that modern people understand law. So talk about that. What does the word Torah itself mean?
I think most Hebrew scholars are going to say we all have the same spiel. Like Torah means something like instruction, but like guidance instruction, coaching maybe would be closer. But again, if you replace all these instances of Torah with coach, see the coaching I have set before you, right? Like,
Yeah, right.
it sounds too light for the American ear, and rightfully so. But it really is, if you want a visual of Torah, it's the prophet over the shoulder of the community of Israel, not the individual Israelite. It's the community of Israel saying, do you see what kind of people you're supposed to become? This is the kind of people. So imagine a world in which nobody is ever setting stumbling blocks before blind people, which is a jerky thing to do anyways, but
Right.
apparently God had to say it in Leviticus 19. Imagine a world where if anybody falls into poverty, which means they don't have enough food, it's not a monetary issue, it's a food issue. They fall into poverty, that instantly their neighbors will lift them up just as they would for a foreigner in the land, right? That's literally one of the laws. Support your brother with food just as you would a foreigner, right? And the assumption there is that you would treat a foreigner that well if they were starving and wandering through your land. Why wouldn't you treat your brother the same way?
Yeah.
So it's this kind of, again, I'm going to use the word imagination there, but it really is getting them over the shoulder and saying, you are meant to become this kind of people. You have never lived in a world in which a nation was like that. You are going, and Deuteronomy is very heavy on like what other nation, the nations are going to come in, they're going to look at you and say, what other nation has a God so near to them, and all these laws and wisdom, right? And when you look across those laws and wisdom, you see it really is building a vision of a people that will kind of exude justice and righteousness in everything they do. And justice, I mean, again, even the word justice today, like
Right.
biblical justice, people think of punishment, harsh,
Yeah.
coercive, or something like that. But biblical justice, the synonym for it in Hebrew is righteousness. So those are interchangeable terms. And it really is like this doing well for you and everybody around, right? Tov is the noun and verb, good, doing well. I'm resisting the metaphor flourishing because that's the one everybody uses,
Yeah.
but and it's been overused a bit too much, but it is something like flourishing. I mean, it's not an accident they use gardening metaphors in a flourishing garden to describe Israel if she were to ever become the kind of people they were to become.
Yeah.
They didn't.
Right. Right. So
But
in
TLDR, they never do.
Yeah. So in chapter 3 of the book, you talk about and bust. I think the chapter is actually called like myth busting the law or
Oh yeah.
something along those lines. And we've already talked about kind of the Christian myth of the law, where the law is like, and this goes back to Martin Luther in some sense, although I think even he was a little more refined than maybe
Yeah.
a lot of people that
Yeah.
have received his tradition have made him out to be. But basically it's like the law is bad and not loving, and Jesus is good and loving. And so there's kind of this antithesis between the law and the gospel. But then like on the flip side, when I was coming of age, this was like during the time of the new atheist movement. And so you had people
Oh
like
yeah.
Richard Dawkins and Christopher
Oh yeah.
Hitchens that were like, look at how stupid these laws are. They don't work. They're unscientific. Like no just society could ever be based on these laws. And both of those perspectives on the law are wrong. So maybe before we dive into some of like the technical mechanics, let's bust some of those myths. So what are some of the popular myths about the law that you've encountered, and how should we reframe the way that we think about those myths?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one is that we think of it as rules that you
Yeah.
either you keep, like God has just put a bunch of rules. This is the story. Again, I think you're right. Luther had a much more nuanced view on this, but
Yeah.
certainly the popularization of Luther's view is that the Jews just wanted to perform rules, and they thought they were righteous by performing rules. But Jesus came to set us free from a list of rules, and legalism is like the worst thing anybody could ever do under that view. And again, it's really hard to read the Gospels and walk away with that view. You kind of have to squint and bend sideways at night to see them that way. But some people are willing. So if it's not a list of rules, then what is it doing? Well, one of the things you can instantly, if you just say like, okay, there are rules there. I mean, like it says you're not to eat blood. I think that actually is a rule that you are just not supposed to go against, right?
Yeah.
Like so it's not that it doesn't have those rules in there, but let's start looking at those rules, the supposed 619 rules that are given to us. I was talking to a friend of mine in Israel recently, and he said he I think he might have even pointed out to me that it was Protestants who came up with that number and then
Yeah.
Jews kind of attached to it. I don't know if that's
Mhm.
true or not, but even if it is 619, 200 some odd of them are positive rules, including like you shall love the Lord your God. Everybody knows that one. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Everybody hopefully knows that one.
Yeah.
Uh, they typically do not know love the foreigner as yourself, which is just, a few inches down the scroll
Yeah.
from love your neighbor as yourself, right? Those are commands. See these commandments I've given these today? You must love the foreigner. You must. Now, what law do we know of today that commands you to love the foreigner, to love your neighbor, to love God, right? To
Yeah.
love your wife, to love your children, or to set stuff aside just in case anybody needs something, right? Like you must do this. You must set aside food in case somebody, like everybody has to have a soup pantry or
Right.
whatever
Yeah.
for people who fall into poverty. And I try to point out in the book that that's not a hypothetical, and it's not poor people who fall into poverty. Anybody who can fall into poverty in ancient Israel. It's not nobody. Not many people could um, set a buffer against poverty and starvation in Israel. Um, so okay, my ADD got me off track. So what question was I answering just then?
Just myth busting.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
what are
myth
some of the
busting.
common
Yeah,
myths? Yeah.
yeah. So this kind of, I think once you just start going through the law and start highlighting the positive commands, you say like, and then the instant question comes, well, wait, why does God want us to love the foreigner? Now the answer he gives is because you were once foreigners, and
Yeah.
in Exodus he says because you know the heart of foreigners, and Moses names his own child Gershom because I was a foreigner there, right? Like it's kind of baked into the system is that Israel knows what it's like to be exploited because they were foreigners and had no political power in that society. Um, but okay, that's part of the answer, but it seems like there's something more than that going on about loving the foreigner as yourself. And once you just start noticing there's a matrix of ideas that are coming together here that it keeps on calling mishpat or justice or tzedakah, righteousness. It just keeps calling them justice. And so, I mean, anybody here who's read Plato's Republic or Meno or any of these knows this issue of like, well, what exactly is justice?
Right.
Is a very complicated idea, and people have all kinds of convoluted ideas about it. But philosophers have been arguing this for a while. Well, the Hebrew Bible is giving a very thick definition of justice, and I think if there's another myth is that if you think the that the laws are just basically rules that you break or keep, um, then you essentially think it's a very simplistic system. I mean, at the end of the day, it's intellectually simpleton.
Right.
Can do this because you just make the list and you go, all right, don't kill, don't adulter, don't
Right.
covet, right?
Check.
Some are easier than others, right? And then you think you've accomplished something by well, any idiot can do that. But as soon as you get in there and you realize what I talk about later in the book is how the laws reason with Israel and Christians, you realize, oh wait, this is demanding a lot of me intellectually, and it's not demanding a lot of me because I have a PhD. It's demanding a lot of an Iron Age farmer in
Right.
Israel, right? Someone who has no formal education, maybe can read or write, maybe. I mean, that's a big maybe, but has heard these laws repeated and has thought about them, ground them through their head day and night. Like, what are the meaning of these laws? Um, that system that I'm describing just doesn't sound anything like the myths that float around about the laws. I think the one myth that has some purchase for us, I don't think it's absolutely true, but that it's harsh, it's all about harsh punishment. Um, I think it's very difficult. I've lived in the majority world. I've worked in the majority world in South America and Central America. And I've taught in Africa. And I think it's just very difficult for people who live in absolute opulence like we do in America.
Right.
I mean, even people in the well below the power at the bottom of the poverty
Right.
line still live in opulence compared to a lot of people around the world
Yeah.
in America. And security, where, like somebody robbing us or some kind of violent action is an intrusion to an otherwise perfectly safe and peaceable life. Not in all areas of America. There's some places that's much worse. And so we can't imagine why somebody would need to, like, with extreme prejudice, as they say in Apocalypse Now, um, and with some degree of what we would call violence today, need to react to certain behaviors of people in the community. And we just cannot. And again, it's a failure of imagining. We can't imagine a world. There are some TV shows that help us with this, um, but you have to watch like 17 episodes
Right.
before you can understand. My daughter actually worked on a television show and production development of the show that did a really good job putting on display. It was a complete accident, but they really displayed some of the principles of the biblical law when you have a small group of people who are just trying to survive
Yeah.
and a very dangerous person gets in their midst. And now what do you do with a person that's super dangerous and bent on doing evil against other people when you're in a small group of people in a survival situation? So that show was Earth Abides on MGM Plus.
Okay.
Yeah, MGM Plus. Um, Again, you have to watch about maybe 10 episodes before you get into it. So, but it helps build our imagination. So I think for a lot of us, and I think towards the end, I say, you really, in some ways, have to suspend your questions and say, like, okay, there is a reasonable world in which this makes sense. I just need to get my head there in some way.
Yeah. Well, and this is, man, the perfect segue to my next question, because we've already talked about how our modern legal theories kind of hinder our ability to understand the biblical law. And I want you to talk about those ancient legal theories. And this is something that, again, this was drilled into my head when I was working on my degree in biblical studies, and something that, well, and I teach seventh graders, right, a medieval history. So it's not
Wow.
quite the same thing as teaching undergrads. But one of the things that I'm constantly trying to help my students understand is that when you live in a different culture, you think differently than we do. Like, your
Right.
patterns of thought are different, right? It's not just that you dress differently and have different customs and different
Right.
food. You don't think about the world the same way. And so obviously in antiquity, like, the way that they thought about law and their legal theories are so much different than our own. So talk to us a little bit about some of the
Yeah.
prevalent, like, legal theories of antiquity.
Yeah, so I think it's commonly held amongst ancient Near Eastern scholars that when you're looking at legal texts, and that they think of these as, we call the common law today, but it's not exactly what we refer to as common law in the American legal system. But this idea that it's a guiding principle, that rather than a list of rules that you break or keep, that most of it is actually like, hey, here's a world in which we shouldn't have stealing. So here's 5 different laws on stealing that kind of give you an imagination for what we mean when we say stealing and what kind of
Yeah.
punishments that might be appropriate to those kinds of things. So the Code of Hammurabi, or Hammurabi, as most people know, if you know anything from the ancient Near East, it's probably the Rosetta Stone in the Code of
Yeah.
Hammurabi. Code of Hammurabi, if you look at the 252, I believe, laws on there, nobody was reading that. It's unclear whether people had access to that text at all.
Yeah.
The Code of Hammurabi was not used in any legal decisions of the tens of thousands of legal cases that we have in cuneiform tablets. None of them appeal to the Code of Hammurabi. Many of them make decisions that go against the principles in the Code of Hammurabi. So, so then you say, well, what was the Code of Hammurabi? Was it actually a set of laws, or was it? I mean, some people think it was for scribes to practice writing. There's all kinds of theories because it doesn't show up much in legal text or legal decisions. So this has led a lot of people to believe that these are really aspirational guidance for judges. Like, think on when you're making decisions about robbery, when you're making decisions about people who have done tort law, where you've done harm to somebody else or
Mhm.
the property, these are the kinds of things you should consider. These are the kinds of severity of punishments or recompense or legal remedies. Obviously, a lot of times it's legal remedies, because in most cases you're not going to throw people in jail if you can avoid it, because as Americans should know, it costs a lot of money to keep people in jail. And they don't come out better most of the time, right?
Yeah.
They come out worse for the wear, and their whole family system comes out worse for the wear. They did have prisons in Mesopotamia. They had industrialized prison systems. They had prisons in Egypt, no prisons in Israel, and the Torah has no provisions for prisons or jailing at all. The closest you get is might be a halfway house, the cities of refuge, but those are only for murder. Um, which is interesting because you had places of refuge in the ancient Near East for various crimes, but it would be for thievery, breaking and entry. There are various things you could go appeal for refuge. Not in Israel. It was only for one thing: being accused of murder, which again, in and of itself, seems to indicate that murder is one of the worst things you can do. And there's all kinds of laws that indicate this as well. And Israel's thinking like murder is what would you call it? It's disastrous beyond the killing of the individual itself.
Yeah.
It's disastrous for the community. So so they have this view of law that basically allows them to form a general legal opinion at the local level, and then so when they apply the law, they're actually applying principled thinking, more than just saying, hey, code section 107 code 3 says X, you violated that, therefore, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Someone who my friend Mark Glanville once said, oh yeah, it's just wisdom for judges. He's Australian, so he said it in a much politer accent, but yeah, it's just wisdom. It's like it's what judges need when they're making these very difficult decisions. And I tried to play that out in the fictional story as well, that you're just pulling on all kinds of parts of the law, including the stories, to try and figure out what do you do in a situation that even if there was exhaustive statutes written about these kinds of situations, this situation still might not fit in any of those statutes.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I found really fascinating about your argument that I had never appreciated before was that it's just like what you said. A lot of these laws start with a specific instance, but they're designed to move towards a general principle. And I think that we get hung up on the specific instance so much that we can't see the general principle that lies behind it.
Yeah, and I would say genuinely, sometimes it's difficult to tell whether they intended to be a principle or instance. You have to, I call it the rule of Dory. Just keep reading, just keep reading, just keep reading. And you, again, they did expect Iron Age farmers, agrarian subsistence farmers, to be able to reason through a lot of this, right? So it's not just for the elites. And I think once you start seeing, I mean, when in class, the one I usually use is thou shalt not murder, right? I'd say you ask, I don't know why, but in class, if you say, give me an example of a law in America today, they almost invariably say, don't speed, right?
Right.
Interestingly, my New York City students did not, because they don't drive, and so they don't think about that. But anywhere else where they have a car, they don't speed. When I say, give me like an uncontroversially true, obvious black and white law from the Bible, they'll say, do not kill. I'll go, great. Okay. Do not kill. That sounds like it's an instance, right? Like if you're in a situation where you kill somebody, don't kill. And then you go, wait a second. Well, what if I back over my wife in the driveway? I didn't see her there, but we did have a fight, and the neighbors heard me screaming, yelling at her. This is not true at all, but is that killing? Even if I had a little bit of thought in my mind, like, oh, I want to kill that woman or something, like, is it, but I accidentally ran over. Is that killing? Right. And if you could establish mens rea in that situation, so the Bible then walks through, the Torah then walks through all these situations. If two guys get in a fight and one gets put out of commission, the healthy guy, the guy that survived the fight, has to care for him and heal him. Right. Yeah. But if one of them brings like a stone implement or a wood implement or a metal implement into a fight, somebody brings brass knuckles in, it's murder, right? And so they're really thinking through all of these situations. And I start in class with saying, like, look, do not kill sounds like a law, like a clear instance. Do not, do not do this one thing. But as soon as you just start asking simple questions, does this count? Does this count? You realize it's very murky. In today's law as well, it's very murky. I've watched enough what are those murder 48 hours or whatever they are, murder things where they're trying to figure out whether it was murder or not. And then and this is why what's interesting about the Hebrew law, which is completely unlike any other Greco-Roman, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Hittite, Ugaritic. There's no other legal code like this in which you have narrative and law and poetry and all kinds of other things, national constitution, all next to each other. And I mean, you have the story of the Exodus,
Yeah.
and then you have a set of legal code, and then you have a set of religious code for the priest and some more story. And in the ancient Near East, like if it's a legal text, it's just a legal text. It just has laws. It doesn't have anything else. Maybe it has a preamble to justify the giving of the law, but that's it. So you have this weird literature where they mix this all together in the law to help you understand what this looks like. So in the case of do not kill, you can very simply ask questions like, okay, do not kill. That seems simple and black and white. Who wrote that law with their own finger into the tablet? Oh God, what did he just do?
Right.
We're in Exodus 20. What did he just do in Exodus 14? Oh, he just murdered a bunch of people. Yeah. And the guy who carried those tablets down off the mountain, what had he done in Egypt? Oh yeah, he murdered somebody in a fit of rage, apparently. And then once he got down the mountain, what did him and the Levites start doing? They started murdering 3,000 of their own countrymen. Now, what does do not murder mean? Right? So even within the giving of the law, the story of the giving of the law, it begs you to think about do not murder as a principle that is going to need fleshing out with lots of concrete instances immediately.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about that the narratives that are interspersed throughout the Torah, because that was another really interesting aspect of the book that I hadn't really considered. And I read Leviticus along with your book, and I wish I remembered Achan. I can't remember the guy's name or whatever, and I should. But the two men in Leviticus 10 that offer strange fire before God,
Nadab and Abihu,
Oh yeah, that's it. And it's one of those stories that's always like, it's so weird. But then when you realize that comes at the long end of a set of instructions about offering the proper sacrifices to God,
right,
it makes perfect sense. So how would kind of interspersing these narratives along with law help the ancient Israelites better understand how to apply those laws in concrete situations?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, I think of it as something like if the idea of justice that God is after here, my comparison, I don't think I use it in the book, but I remember when I was trying to teach my older kids about what's healthy and what's not healthy, and immediately they wanted a list of rules. Is cottage cheese healthy? Are avocados healthy? Are French fries healthy? Right? And you end up going, well, in this situation, yes, but if this amount, no. And well, if they're fried in this kind of an oil, then it's fine. But and if the oil's not reused twice, and if you don't have too much, and there's all of these moving parts as to what something is healthy, but together you can kind of see a picture emerge. But it takes a few years for young people to really get a solid picture of what healthy looks like when it comes to the body. And then you have healthy relationships and other kinds of, you extend the metaphor out. I think there's something like that going on with ideas of justice. Is you just need lots of the guiding principles, the kind of non-negotiables, like this is going to be a dominant feature in your thinking on this topic forevermore. And then you need lots of these instances that help frame the principle, right? So clearly there are instances where killing somebody else is the right thing to do, or it can be, I shouldn't say, not even the right thing to do. It's just an acceptable thing to do, right? You're not going to be judged before your creator for doing it in that circumstance. And we can think of all kinds of situations where accidental death or intentionally restraining somebody or, shooting somebody, or, you can think of all kinds of situations where you would have justified killing of somebody. And I know the hardcore pacifists are going to say, no, there's never news. But even if you're a hardcore pacifist and you'd say there's never a justified reason to actively kill somebody, you can imagine a world in which you do something that ends up killing somebody where they still would not, and you would justify the action that accidentally ended up killing them. Okay, so you need lots of instances to think about, well, what is it about killing that is actually the part that God's concerned about, right? It's like when I tell my kids, I want you to be healthy, and they're like, okay, what's the thing that you want? And in my mind, I'm thinking, I want you to be able, when you're 80 years old, to stand up under your own power, to have a clean heart and lungs and veins and for all your muscles to work. And yes, you'll be in pain, but you can function as an independent adult. There's a lot like that going on when it comes to this really amorphous, fuzzy idea of justice. Is there, justice is also called tov, good, or being well. It's also called what we would translate beautiful, yafa or yafe, something being the way that it's supposed to be. It's also called true. Like there's instances where it's all, the word true is referring to this. It just takes a lot of examples. I'll give one more example. It's like learning algebra, right? Like when you take an algebra class, think of how many examples you work. You get the principles. Here's the distributive property. Okay, that's the principle. But then I need about 20 different examples of that before I finally go like, okay, I've got it. Now I can extend the idea of algebraic distribution out into the world, right? Or arithmetic distribution out into the world. So, and I've lost track of your original question, but that's where I've ended.
Yeah, no. That was perfect. Again, just talking about that dynamic between narrative and law. And,
Narrative. Yeah.
And, but that also, brings up another question that you address in the book too, which I think is really relevant, and that is that the law is designed to be community forming. So again, I think one of these aspects of our modern legal theory that gets us hung up with the law in the Old Testament is that we think about laws in individualistic senses. Like if I break a law, I'm going to be punished for it, and that's kind of the end of the story. But as you argue in your book, it's not. We can't really read the Torah through the lens of modern individualism, because this was much more about how you create a community. So I would just love for you to speak on the kind of the communal aspect of the law.
I can also imagine people saying, well, yeah, American law was supposed to be community, and it's all about, rights actually is responsibilities towards your neighbor. Blah. Yes. Regardless, this is where we've ended up with this absolute individualist ethic that we kind of live and breathe in America. So I don't know how the Protestant libertarian crowd is going to take this, but the biblical authors are just not into individual liberty like the average American is. Even the average left-leaning, communist American,
right?
They probably have a higher view of individual liberty than the biblical authors do. Not that they don't have strong views about liberty, but it means something different when it's, you're free to be a responsible citizen.
Right.
It's almost like the Human Rights Declaration of the UN Human Rights Declaration that Charles Malik helped author, who is a Lebanese Christian. It's like human rights means I have the right to marry somebody that I want to marry. I have the right to educate my children. That I can, So for Americans, we're like, well, yeah, duh, of course. It doesn't even register in our minds that might not be a fundamental right to most people in the world, or to many people in the world. So, so what they're really interested in is this issue of justice, which, to borrow a phrase from Hillary Rodham Clinton, it takes a village to create justice.
Yeah.
There is no individual that can act justly in the Bible, and that's, and I am including the New Testament here as well. It's the comparison I think I make, the one I usually make is it's justice and ethical behavior and morality and justice in Scripture is more like soccer and less like running, cross country running or something, right?
Yeah.
It takes the entire team to perform well, which then also includes the individual perform. You're only as strong as your weakest player. You're only as fast as your slowest runner in soccer, right? And so it does require individuals to take responsibility and act. But if it's just an individual, like imagine, well, you don't have to imagine. The best example is, I don't remember what Olympics it was, but it was the first Olympics where they let professional athletes participate, and the U.S. basketball team was like all NBA all-star players, and they got beat by Lithuania.
Yeah.
And I still remember the interview with the coach from Lithuania. They're like, how did you pull off, like these, mid-level European players from Lithuania? How did you beat the Americans? They're like, easy. We just passed the ball and played as a team.
Right.
The Americans, they all want to slant, they all wanted to dunk the ball, and they all wanted to showboat. And I think that's kind of a good illustration for what the biblical authors are hitting at. The Torah is trying to get all of Israel to create justice. If there are one of the great concerns of the Torah is systematic exploitation of the vulnerable. Like that comes up over and over and over again. And then the prophets reiterate it. The reason God is killing the northern tribes of Israel and eventually the southern tribes of Judah is because of their exploitation of the vulnerable. But it wasn't just individuals, it's that the community had grown to accept the exploitation of the individuals as a normal thing that is okay, including the exploitation of their own children, the exploitation of the poor, of the foreigner, the exploitation of even wealthy people. I try to point out in the book,
Yeah.
vulnerable does not mean poor and disenfranchised. You can be a wealthy person and be in a vulnerable situation according to the law, and they're still worried about you. The law still cares about you in the Torah. So it takes everybody participating together. And if you have the majority of people oriented towards righteousness and justice, and caring and creating good, then the oddballs are seen that they need to be purged out. The person who's intent on doing evil and kind of wrecking the whole system, you have to purge them. You got to get them out. By the way, this is the New Testament rhetoric as well.
Right.
Paul,
Mhm.
Jesus and Paul
Yeah.
and early church fathers too, the didache, the early church guidance for how churches should handle themselves. It's like, if you have somebody in causing trouble, a quarrel, warn them, work with them. But if you realize that they're just going to cause trouble, it doesn't say lay hands and pray on it. It says get them out. Get them
Right.
out.
Yeah.
That's right. So you have a very similar mentality that I would assume is derived from the Torah and Paul's thinking there, is that you just got to purge because it's about the unity of the community headed towards flourishing and righteousness and justice. So I think, it's probably the biggest indictment of American or Western Christianity that's kind of infected all Christianity around the world at this point, is that we think it's all about me. We kind of have this, whether it's Platonic or enlightened or not, but this kind of Greco-Roman, it's about me getting my soul straight with God so that
Right.
I can act ethically and morally. And they go the opposite way around. They're like, no. If the community can be just and righteous and moral and ethical or good and all those kinds of things, then that gets the individual. The individual comes along with that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's great. Yeah, in part 3 of your book, you talk about the different strategies and skills that readers need to really understand the biblical law, and you talk about the ancient context and the literary context. And I think we've already done a good job of addressing that. But then you also talk about the theological skills that readers of the law need to really fully appreciate it. And as we take the next 15 minutes to kind of tie this all together, what are for readers of the law? What are some of the theological elements that we need to keep in mind as we're reading through the biblical law?
Yeah, I'm going to look at what I said. Let's see. Well, okay. So I think I'm kind of joking, but kind of not. One serious thing that I think a lot of people miss because when they read the law, it's so disorienting and orientating. Sorry, I've been in the UK too much. Disorienting for us Americans. If you would imagine for a moment that the law is actually ultimately concerned with kind of everybody coming along and being upheld together as best you can in the broken world, awaiting the return of God, the King who's going to re-enthrone himself and be with his people. That seems to be the great hope of the Torah, which gets renewed in this new, unexpected way in the New Testament. So that means every statute you read, like when you take a slave, you must treat them this way. When you take a war bride, you must treat them this way. As offensive as that sounds, you just have to suspend your offense. You have to suspend your questions, which most of us, our question is going to be, what kind of a God is letting people taking prisoners and marrying them? What kind of a God? And again, think about okay, you have to ask a different set of questions. What principle is this aiming at? Who is this trying to restrain from doing some kind of evil, or allowing someone to be protected so that they can flourish, even if in a very minimalistic way? So let's take war brides as a good example. The Torah, I think, I don't know how big of a deal I make of this in a book. I always make a big deal of this to my own colleagues because I think my own colleagues forget this sometimes, that the Torah is not describing the way the world should be. It's describing the way the world can be given the fact that it's all messed up, right?
Yeah.
So the laws concerning war bride, the teaching is assuming that Israel will go to war to protect herself, or they will go to war as they go in and conquest, right? And that they will see women that they will, desire to have sexually. That will happen, young men, and they will have killed their husbands, the men, right? Because no man's gonna let you come in and just take his village. So they've gone to war. They've had to kill the warriors, and now there are these women and children and other folks left over. That men will be tempted to sexually exploit that woman in that moment. That seems to be the assumption of that law.
Yeah.
And so it says, great, you want to have sex with her right now where there's no consequences. You can get her pregnant, you walk away, whatever. She's left vulnerable on her own, which happens all the time in war, right? I mean, there's a whole generation of Vietnamese children that are half American, half Vietnamese from Vietnam, right? Where men did exactly that. This says, no, you can have sex with her, but you have to take her home. She has to shave her head. She has to take a month to grieve her losses. And then you cannot divorce her. You marry any other woman, you can divorce her, right? If like she's evil, she's conniving, whatever,
Right.
you can divorce that woman. This one you can never divorce. You can never diminish her rations. You have to feed her, pay for her. You have to take care of this woman for the rest of your life. Every single thing they instruct you to do goes against wanting to have exploitative sex with her right now. It just goes in the exact opposite direction. No. You take a bite, you keep it forever, and you have to, and you can't take a bite right now. Yeah. So any kind of like lust that's raging in you at the moment is gone. Now, for most people, they're like, wait, that's it? That's the justice?
Right.
I would suggest there are some books you can read about war sexual assault written by theologians that have accounts of what happens in war along that would be worth reading. My favorite one that I think is extremely powerful, written by a Congolese man who was a child soldier himself, but piles of slain, heaps of corpses. It's about the book of Nahum, but he interviews a lot of Congolese atrocity survivors and integrates their experiences with the kind of depictions of atrocities in Nahum and why Nahum would actually be a comfort. Nahum, the word is it's actually comfort. It means comfort, right? And so how can Nahum be comforting when it describes these horrible atrocities? So I think, the fact that we can't imagine a way in which taking a war bride like that seems fair or just starts with, well, we think she should have absolute independent agency. And that now that her husband's dead, she's free to choose whatever she wants. And she can just go start a new life on her own. She'll just go build a ranch somewhere and do that. It's like when really all the particulars run in the exact opposite direction. Her husband said she has no protection now. It's actually dealing with protection of women and children when there are inevitably battles, war, etc. So I think those kinds of, I call it theologically reading, but it really is checking impulses within ourselves. And then again, being willing to extend that imagination and think in some ways very creatively, just for the way of thinking through, like, what would this have looked like? Why would God care about this particular issue? Who is God trying to protect? And again, you get to Jesus, it's no different. Like you can look through Jesus' teaching and say, who is he excoriating and who is he trying to protect?
Right.
And he's very clear. His final judgment, as often as you didn't do it to the least of these, you didn't do it to mine. He carries the Torah's logic straight into every word that he says as well. So I think those are the kinds of basic theological moves, but it really does require checking ourselves before we wreck ourselves on the rocks of the law here, and then being willing to ask a new set of questions and go down the line. And so all I do in the book is try to say, here are some ways in which you could do it. So I give an example of like, what would it look like if you took love your neighbor as yourself and love the foreigners? If you just took those as fundamentally true principles into the police academy and started training police with that mentality and how they handle people who they've suspected or have caught and doing heinous crimes, right? And so it's one tiny example, but I'm just trying to create that imagination, which it's just a theological imagination.
Yeah. Well, I have two final questions for you. The first, and I know that we were talking before the show, and you're not intentionally so because you're an Old Testament scholar. You said you've tried to avoid a lot of the Pauline scholarship and things
Right.
like that. But I couldn't help after reading your book and some of the others that I was talking to you about before the show. Just the way that this impacts my reading of the Gospels and Paul. I don't really think I've fully understood where that's going to take me quite yet. But I feel like I'm reading some passages with fresh eyes
Right.
after going through your book. And so, what would you say that this should do for our reading of Jesus, Paul, and the other writers of the New Testament?
Yeah, I think one thing that we found out in the prophets as well. In many ways, Jesus is teaching and Paul's teaching are doing what the prophets are doing as well, but they're doing it under this new kingdom that, that
Mhm.
obviously I'm not saying there's nothing new about Jesus, but in
Right.
some ways it's a very standard pattern that rhymes with everything in the Torah and extends the logic of the Torah. So one of the things we find out again with Jesus and Paul in a very pointed way is that not all Torah instruction is equal. Like there are things that take priority.
Mhm.
Um, so when Jesus is confronting with this issue of like, hey, Moses said we can divorce a woman. He goes, yeah. Moses let you divorce a woman, but then he jumps from the divorce is in Exodus or number. I think it's in Numbers. Then he jumps back to Genesis 1 and 2 and says, but that's not how it was from the beginning. And then he starts schooling them on wanting to have sex, and he almost implies that the reason they want to divorce their wives is so they can have sex with a
Right.
younger woman. But if you look at his response, that's what it seems
Right.
he seems to be thinking they want to do. And he's like, no, that's not how it's supposed to be. So you get this kind of this prioritizing of law, right? That there are certain principles in the law that take preeminence, and then they order other. Now, Paul Sloan has done an excellent job fleshing this issue out with Jesus, and I think you can think of it very
Jesus and the Law
quickly.
of Moses. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jesus and the law of Moses, and then you can take what he's doing there and run very quickly to Paul and Peter and James and John as well, and see how they're doing something very similar. Is they're saying like, look, because it's teaching, you know, who would take a semester long class and think that every sentence the professor said was of equal,
Right.
instructional
Right.
value, right?
Right.
There are certain things that no, you have to understand this in order for these other five things to make sense. And so I think getting those nodes in place is something that Jesus does. But again, you don't need the New Testament to realize like there are certain nodes that come up again and again and again as central to understanding everything in the Torah, and therefore understanding what flourishing in the kingdom of God looks like, even with Jesus in the new kingdom of God.
Yeah, and that's really that is a perfect segue to my final question. And this is, I think, the one that a lot of people struggle with. And again, I'm going back to the Lutheran model of people. A lot of people are just like, well, the law was then, this is now. We don't have to worry about any of that. But it doesn't work. The law does have continuing relevance for Christians today. So talk to us about that. Like, what is for Christians that want to faithfully honor God? What role does the biblical law play for us as modern Christians?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. It's and I hope this book creates a pathway. It doesn't give the answers to that, obviously.
Right.
I saw a reviewer complained about that I don't really tell Christians, and I'm like, well, I pretty clearly stated that that wasn't my goal in
Right.
the first
Right.
chapter, um, but it does create pathways to start thinking about that. And the example I give is if you read through the Torah and then you just hop over to the prophets, start with Isaiah, maybe skip Ezekiel for the time being and go to the other ones, just for the point, and just say, what is the 4/4 ACDC boom tap? Like it's constantly coming back again and again and again. And I think everybody will see very obvious, constant, regular drum beats that the Torah hits and that later prophets will pick up on again. And once you get those kind of locked in, and again, this is that kind of prioritizing, then you can start thinking about all the oddball stuff. And I'm a drummer, so I'd say the
Right.
syncopated beats, like the little ghost notes, those little things that come in from the side. And you can start placing this. Oh, okay, that fits within the logic of this idea. Why would you want to protect a murderer? Like, why would you have a city of refuge that protects a murder? Well, it doesn't protect a murderer. It protects somebody accused of
Mhm.
murder, right? And I assume the city of refuge, people are running in there who did murder somebody
Right.
saying, I didn't do it,
Right.
right? And so it gives them a route to adjudication. And so once you get those kind of 4:4, here is the ground pounding beat of what the Torah is doing in principle, and the instances will help shape those. And I think the eye for an eye, tooth for tooth thing was the most surprising thing for me when I worked through that years ago. I was like, wait, this is a principle, and the instances are to protect slaves from being hit by their masters. Like, who would have guessed that, right? Then you can just start very easily looking around in your life and saying, well, what is like that? Like, where is somewhere in my life where I might be tempted to exploit someone? Where and again, most Americans live basically a Judeo-Christian ethic, even if they're atheist.
Right. Yeah.
So we already embody a lot of this. Well, even my atheist friends already embody a lot of the Hebraic values of justice. But, to give one example, Leviticus 19, which might be one of the greatest chapters in all of the Torah, says you can't oppress somebody. And then that's the principle. And you go, well, what do you mean by oppressing, right? Next line is you can't hold a day laborer's wages till the next day, right? You're like, oh, okay, that's a concrete way. I wouldn't have ever called that oppressing, but let me think, why would that be oppressive? Okay, well, I lived in Newark, New Jersey, in an all-immigrant neighborhood for 13 years. There were a lot of day laborers. There were a lot of people who were living hand to mouth. And a lot of my church was a lot of blue collar people, mostly blue collar people who worked some trades. And they told me horrific stories of not just people exploiting immigrants who are non-documented illegal immigrants, but immigrants who exploited immigrants because they knew they couldn't. They were like, I know you can't go to the law and tell on me, right?
Yeah.
And so these horrific stories where people are actually using their strategic advantage in life to exploit people and withhold money and say, I mean, horrible stories like people doing 3 days of hard work and then the guy going like, yeah, I'm not going to really pay you. Go tell the police if you like, and then they're going to turn you over to ICE and you're going to go home. And so I don't think there's, we're kind of in a toss-up where genteel modern American life is living a lot of these principles to the best we can, but there's still lots of ways in which we're cutting against the way of God. And I think Jesus shows up and he's just like, look, this should have been obvious.
Right.
Don't, the Sermon on the Mount, don't think that I've come to if you hear anything I'm saying as overthrowing the Torah, you are mishearing me.
Right.
Everything I'm saying is in the direction. It's in the path of the Torah. It's the way the Torah goes. And so he, my guilt point would be like, hey, Christians, Jesus thought all of this mattered and carries forward. So maybe we should. Paul's last act as a free man is giving an animal sacrifice in the temple in order to convince the Jerusalem elders that he is not teaching the giving up of the Torah. Right. That he's like, yeah, I'll do that. And he saw that as something that he should do. So start there and then say, okay, now that we have these principles, what does it look like? What does it look like for a police officer to love their neighbor while they are arresting them? Like like brass tacks. How do you put on the handcuffs? How do you talk to them? How do you reason with them? How do you get their family involved? It's not hard to start making those connections once you get into the principles and instances and see how they function together to shape and reason with Israel. And I would say to reason with us as what Paul calls the Israel of God in Romans.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Dru Johnson, we've covered a lot of ground today. I really appreciate your time. The book is phenomenal. It's called Understanding Biblical Law, Skills for Thinking with and Through Torah. I have interviewed scholars that have written some pretty technical works, but I think this is someone that any educated person listening to the show could pick up and easily understand. Very incredible, just a game-changing book. Before I let you go, as my introduction suggested today, you're involved in a lot of different projects and everything. So just take some time to where can people find you? Where can people find your work if they want to see more of what you're doing?
Well, I mean, all my books are on Amazon if you want to, but you should buy them from a local book dealer.
Yep.
I'm not saying anybody should buy my books, but if you do, buy it from a local bookshop, have them order it. But I work at Wycliffe Hall at the University of Oxford. That's my main job, directing the project with Jewish, Muslim, and Christian scholars on evolutionary science and creation theologies. That's been a very fun and fruitful engagement. I run the Center for Hebraic Thought hold on. There's my. Um, we have the weekly podcast, The Biblical Mind. We're also podcasters where we just interview. I interview just people who do anything interesting. We should have you on there as well. And yeah, I think that's it. And then I get around, but I'm not like a Carmen Imes. I don't go like speak everywhere in the world,
Right.
or Tom Wright, I should say too. But yeah, I'm not coming to a theater near you, but that's where you can find some of my stuff.
Yeah. Well, again, Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for just taking the book seriously, and I'm glad it struck a chord with you.